Hey, this is Jamey with Stonemeyer Games, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite game mechanism in Parks, a game for 1 to 5 players that I played for the first time this past Wednesday and really enjoyed because it includes one of my favorite mechanisms in games, which is a one-way time track for action selection, where you probably most famously seen it in Tokaido, where the player who is the furthest back on the track, it is their turn, and they can move forward to any space that is not occupied by another player within limits. There's usually a limit in these games. You can't just jump forward all the way to the end and have nothing else to do right from the start. Parks does a few things really interesting with this. One of it is that it uses rounds. So unlike Tokaido, you can jump right to the front of the track in Parks, and but because there's 4 rounds in the game, you'll get another round after that, or another round, depending on what round it is. 2 is you get 2 workers on the track, which makes things really interesting. It means that if there is an action that you really need, you can use your first hiker to jump ahead way on the track to get it, and use the other worker to more incrementally and slowly gain those actions. It adds a lot of interesting choices with those hikers, a lot of options since you do have 2 hikers to move along the time track. One of the other cool things about this time track is that it's assembled randomly every round using these tiles. So, and you add another tile to this track every round. So every round, the time track itself, the order of the actions is going to be different, and you add a new tile to it. So every time you play in the first few rounds, you're going to not have a certain tile that maybe you had in the previous game, but from then on, every round, you have the same tiles plus 1 in a different order because they're randomized. I really, really like the variability this adds to the game. And it means that a board wasn't necessary, at least for these tiles. There was a board in the game, but not for the tiles. It kind of slims down the components list a bit. One of the other cool things about it is that it has a mechanism called the campfire, that lets you exhaust the campfire to place your hiker on an action space that is already occupied by another hiker. Normally you can't do that, but I love the backup of if you really, really need this action space. And it's really interesting to see when players actually use this. Sometimes it's really early in the round because of order of operations. You really need one thing to do the next thing. Oftentimes we try to save it till late in the round, but I really like the different times in the game where this is more valuable, especially on a one-way time track where players are moving their hikers off the tracks. Sometimes you really would use this early in the round, and it doesn't really hurt you all that much because then the hikers are going to clear off other spots that you could have already used. I think I had one other thing. Oh, the last thing about it. I mentioned early on that in Tokaido, the player who is the last on the track is the current player, which is a great mechanism. And I've seen this in Thebes, Francis Drake, Australia. Really, really cool. But, and because usually those tracks represent time in some way. However, sometimes that can lead to situations where, even though it's really obvious by looking at the track, players are used to clockwise play, and so you might forget whose turn it is. Whereas in Parks, you just always play clockwise. It doesn't matter where you are on the track in terms of turn order. You always do clockwise turn order. It flows really well that way. Turns are very quick. They just flow around the table until the round finishes. I really, really like that. I don't know if one way is better than the other, but it seems to work really well in Parks, especially with the 2 hikers on the tracks. I will post a link to a video below where I've talked about one-way time tracks or time as a mechanism in games because I really, really love games that use time as a mechanism. And I think Parks does that in an interesting way with this one-way track, action selection track. So if you have another favorite game that this reminds you of that uses that one-way track idea, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments. And feel free to check out that other video because the game you mentioned might already be on that video too, which is still worth discussing, of course. Yeah, all right, thanks for joining me today. Oh, and also, I don't know if you noticed, but I have a new office now, new home office. So that's why the backdrop is a little different today. I'm still figuring out the best angle to put this camera, but hopefully this is okay for now. All right, thanks for joining me.